Welcome to Crime in the Shadows, where we unravel gripping tales of crime, betrayal, and the dark motives hidden in the hearts of those we trust. Tonight, we delve into the haunting case of Meredith Callaway, a name synonymous with power and prestige in the high-stakes world of luxury real estate. Behind her polished exterior and towering success, however, lay a web of secrets, manipulation, and a deadly relationship that would ultimately unravel her carefully curated life. The story begins in Seattle, a city known for its shimmering skyline, bustling innovation, and ceaseless rain that blankets its streets in mystery. It was in this city that Meredith built her empire, transforming rundown properties into dazzling estates for the elite. By her 40s, she had risen from humble beginnings to become the founder of Callaway Estates, a real estate powerhouse catering to the wealthiest 1%. But success often comes with a price. Meredith's journey to the top was not without sacrifice. Born to a strict schoolteacher mother and a hard-working construction worker father, she learned early that survival required ambition, cunning, and control. These qualities became her greatest strengths, but they also left her deeply isolated. Despite her public image as an unstoppable businesswoman, Meredith lived a life of quiet loneliness, shielded from genuine connection by the walls she had built to protect herself. Her marriage to Matthew Callaway, a high-ranking CIA operative, was no fairy tale. Their union was one of convenience, a strategic partnership that afforded Meredith respectability and Matthew a polished public image to obscure his covert operations. With Matthew frequently away on assignments, Meredith was left to fill the void with work, power, and, eventually, the pursuit of thrills. That pursuit led her to Evan Ritchie, a 26-year-old with a brooding charm and an edge that both fascinated and unsettled her. Evan had been a rising star in college athletics until an injury shattered his dreams. Left adrift, he cycled through dead-end jobs and shallow relationships, carrying the weight of a broken childhood and a string of questionable decisions. Their paths crossed at an exclusive charity gala, where Evan was tending bar, his rugged handsomeness catching Meredith's eye like a forbidden spark. For Meredith, Evan was everything her world of meticulously controlled luxury was not: raw, unpredictable, and exhilarating. For Evan, Meredith represented an escape, a glimpse into a life of privilege and excess that had always seemed out of reach. The connection was instant and magnetic, but beneath their initial attraction lay a dangerous imbalance. Meredith thrived on control, and Evan, desperate to belong, was drawn into her orbit like a moth to flame. Their relationship, secret and intoxicating, began as a thrilling escape for them both. Yet even as Meredith showered Evan with gifts, luxury, and promises of security, the cracks in their dynamic began to show. Meredith viewed Evan as a fleeting indulgence, a toy to distract her from the monotony of her carefully structured life. But for Evan, whose life had been marked by rejection and instability, Meredith became an anchor, one he couldn't bear to lose. Unbeknownst to Meredith, Evan carried more than just his charm into her world. He brought with him the shadows of a chilling past, one that would soon collide with Meredith's own secrets, igniting a storm of jealousy, obsession, and betrayal that neither of them could control. As the rain poured relentlessly over Seattle, the stage was set for a tragedy that would expose the lies and fractures hiding behind the Callaway name. Stay with us, as the tale of Meredith Callaway unfolds, plunging us deeper into the shadows where trust is shattered, and darkness reigns supreme. Seattle's gleaming skyline stood as a testament to Meredith Callaway's relentless ambition. Rising from her modest upbringing, Meredith was the kind of woman who could step into any room and command attention, not just with her elegance but with the sharp mind and iron will that had built her empire. Yet behind the perfectly tailored suits and radiant smiles was a woman whose need for control masked an ever-present loneliness. Meredith Callaway was the daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a construction worker father, raised in a modest neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and dreams often faded under the weight of daily struggles. Her mother, strict and uncompromising, instilled in her a sense of discipline, while her father's tireless work ethic inspired her determination. From an early age, Meredith realized that survival meant standing out, and she quickly became adept at charming her way through doors that might otherwise have been closed. A scholarship to study architecture at a prestigious university was her ticket out of the ordinary. She thrived in the competitive environment, catching the eye of influential professors who saw in her a rare blend of talent and ambition. By the time she graduated, Meredith was ready to take on the world. Starting at a small real estate firm, she turned overlooked properties into highly sought-after assets. Her meteoric rise eventually led to the founding of Callaway Estates, a firm synonymous with luxury, innovation, and exclusivity. By her 40s, Meredith had everything, or so it seemed. Her name was etched in the circles of the wealthy and powerful, her properties graced the covers of architectural magazines, and her fortune was unmatched. Yet, beneath the surface, she was a woman trapped by the very image she had created. Her marriage to Matthew Callaway, a high-ranking CIA operative, was as polished and strategic as her career. For the public, they were the ideal power couple. In private, they were distant, each consumed by their own pursuits. Matthew's constant absences for covert missions left Meredith alone to face the gnawing void that success could never fill. Matthew, a man of precision and secrecy, was as much a mystery to Meredith as he was to those around him. His work demanded discretion, and Meredith never asked questions. Over time, their marriage became less of a union and more of a business arrangement. She valued the stability and societal respectability he provided, while he appreciated the facade of a perfect home life her reputation offered. It was in this loneliness that Meredith found herself drawn to Evan Ritchie, a 26-year-old bartender with a past as fractured as the lives he served drinks to. Evan had once been a promising college athlete with a bright future ahead of him, until a career-ending injury sent his life spiraling out of control. Born into a family marked by turbulence, an abusive father and an absent mother, Evan had grown up learning to fend for himself. His charming exterior masked a darker reality, a man who drifted through life, burdened by rejection and haunted by whispers of a past he refused to confront. Meredith and Evan's worlds collided at an exclusive charity gala. She, the centerpiece of the event, exuded confidence and allure. He, a handsome but weary bartender, caught her eye with a disarming mix of rawness and vulnerability. Their connection was electric, built on unspoken desires. Meredith sought excitement and youth, while Evan craved stability and validation. To Meredith, Evan was a distraction from her carefully curated life. To Evan, Meredith was an opportunity to taste the luxury he had only dreamed of. But as the lines between their lives blurred, the imbalance in their relationship began to show. Meredith controlled Evan with extravagant gifts, access to her luxurious lifestyle, and promises of a future he could never have imagined. She moved him into the guesthouse of her sprawling estate, ensuring he remained close, yet at arm's length, a possession, not a partner. Evan, desperate to belong, clung to her, unaware that he was stepping into a gilded cage. Matthew, though often absent, was no fool. He sensed the changes in Meredith and grew suspicious. Behind his calm exterior, the instincts honed by years in the intelligence field kicked in. He began to quietly observe, piecing together the fragments of Meredith's secret life. Unbeknownst to her, Matthew's interest in Evan was not just about his wife's infidelity. Evan's face stirred a memory, one that linked him to a tragedy Matthew had never spoken of, a tragedy tied to his daughter from a previous marriage. Samantha Callaway, Matthew's estranged daughter, had vanished years earlier, her disappearance shrouded in mystery. Her body was later found near the home of her then-boyfriend, Evan Ritchie. Though suspicion swirled around Evan, lack of evidence meant the case went cold. Now, as Matthew watched Evan weave his way into Meredith's life, the past began to surface, its shadows reaching into the present. Meredith, blind to the storm brewing around her, continued her entanglement with Evan, unaware of the danger creeping ever closer. Her carefully built world, her fragile marriage, and her intoxicating relationship with Evan were all on a collision course. In Seattle's endless rain, the stage was set for a tragedy no one could stop. In the Calloway estate, where luxury masked the quiet cracks of loneliness, shadows of past and present began to converge. Meredith Calloway, at the height of her professional success, could see the fissures forming beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life. The deeper she became entangled with Evan Ritchie, the more she felt her world slipping out of her control. And for someone like Meredith, who thrived on control, this was a feeling she could neither tolerate nor comprehend. Meredith's relationship with Evan had started as a fleeting distraction, a way to fill the void left by her emotionally distant husband and the cold confines of her towering ambitions. She had meticulously kept the affair a secret, believing it to be just another facet of her carefully compartmentalized life. Yet as months passed, the lines blurred. Meredith, a woman who prided herself on being untouchable, began to notice the cost of her actions. Her affair, once an exhilarating escape, started to demand more energy, more lies, and more of her soul than she had anticipated. Evan, on the other hand, was no longer satisfied with playing the role of Meredith's secret indulgence. At first, he reveled in the luxuries she offered, the guest house, the designer clothes, the access to a world he had only seen on television. But beneath his charming exterior, Evan was a man deeply fractured. His childhood in a broken home, with an abusive father and an absent mother, had left him desperate for stability and belonging. To him, Meredith wasn't just a lover, she was his anchor. And the thought of losing her was something he couldn't bear. Meredith began to notice the shift in Evan. His once playful demeanor became tense and possessive. He questioned her whereabouts, pressed her for more time, and grew visibly uneasy whenever she mentioned work or social engagements. At first, Meredith found his jealousy flattering, a validation of her power over him. But as his behavior grew more erratic, she felt a creeping unease. Control, her lifelong ally, was slipping through her fingers. Meanwhile, Matthew Calloway was quietly piecing together the truth. His instincts, sharpened by years of covert operations, had detected the subtle changes in Meredith's behavior. Her late nights, unexplained absences, and the way she dismissed his questions were all red flags. But what caught Matthew's attention the most was the name Evan Ritchie. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name tied to a tragedy that still haunted him. Samantha Calloway, Matthew's daughter from a previous marriage, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances nearly a decade earlier. At the time, Samantha had been dating a young man, Evan Ritchie. When her body was discovered near Evan's home, the evidence was circumstantial but damning. Rumors swirled, and the town whispered of Evan's involvement, yet the police lacked the proof to charge him. With no resolution, the case grew cold, but Matthew never forgot. Now, seeing Evan entwined in Meredith's life, Matthew's suspicions reignited like a flame fed fresh oxygen. As Matthew delved deeper into Evan's past, the pieces began to align. Evan had moved from town to town after Samantha's death, leaving behind a trail of broken relationships and whispers of trouble. The man now living under Meredith's roof wasn't just a fleeting fling, he was a dangerous shadow from Matthew's past. But how could he confront Meredith with this revelation? She had always been fiercely independent, unwilling to accept interference, even from her husband. Matthew knew he needed to tread carefully, for the stakes were far higher than just a broken marriage. Meredith, oblivious to Matthew's investigation, wrestled with her own doubts about Evan. She had always been drawn to his rawness, his vulnerability, but lately, those same traits began to unsettle her. There were moments when Evan's charm felt forced, his affection tinged with desperation. And then there were the stories he shared, vague accounts of a troubled past, with gaps that left Meredith uneasy. She told herself it wasn't her place to pry. After all, she had never wanted their relationship to be anything more than an escape. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Evan was hiding something dark. Evan, too, felt the weight of secrets. He had always been careful to avoid mentioning Samantha, steering conversations away from his past. But being in the Calloway estate, surrounded by reminders of wealth and power, stirred memories he had tried to bury. The guilt, the whispers of townsfolk, the haunting image of Samantha's lifeless body, they all came rushing back. And now, with Matthew's presence looming like a silent threat, Evan felt the walls closing in. The Calloway household had become a fragile house of cards, each member holding secrets that could topple everything. Meredith's growing unease with Evan, Matthew's quiet investigation, and Evan's buried guilt were all hurtling toward a collision. In the quiet halls of their sprawling estate, where everything appeared pristine, the air was thick with tension. Each glance, each word, seemed loaded with unspoken truths, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for the right moment to strike. Seattle's unrelenting rain pattered against the estate's windows, a constant reminder of the storm brewing within. Meredith's life, once perfectly controlled, was now slipping into chaos. Evan, tethered to her by obsession and desperation, was unraveling before her eyes. And Matthew, haunted by his past and driven by suspicion, was preparing to confront the darkness head-on. The Calloway name, so carefully guarded, was about to be dragged into the shadows, and no one would emerge unscathed. The Calloway estate, usually a bastion of calm and control, had become a pressure cooker of unspoken tensions and veiled suspicions. Matthew Calloway could no longer stand idly by. His wife, Meredith, was entangled with a man whose very name stirred memories of tragedy and betrayal. Worse still, the man now lived under their roof, worming his way into her life. For Matthew, the threat was no longer abstract, it was personal. And as a man trained to read danger and act decisively, Matthew knew it was time to confront the storm brewing in his home. Matthew's investigation into Evan Ritchie had been quiet but thorough. Through his network of covert contacts, he pieced together Evan's movements over the past decade. Each step revealed a man haunted by instability, a trail of short-lived jobs, broken relationships, and whispers of violence. But it was the connection to Samantha Calloway, Matthew's estranged daughter, that truly ignited his resolve. Samantha's death had left a scar that never healed. Her body had been found in a shallow creek near Evan's home, and though the evidence was circumstantial, Matthew had always believed Evan was involved. Now, seeing Evan ingratiate himself with Meredith, Matthew's suspicion hardened into certainty. Meredith, however, was oblivious to her husband's growing vigilance. She was preoccupied with her own unease. Evan had become more volatile, his affection tinged with a desperation that made her uncomfortable. The once exhilarating thrill of their relationship had soured, leaving her feeling trapped. Evan's constant need for reassurance, his probing questions about her whereabouts, and his barely concealed jealousy all grated against her carefully constructed sense of independence. The tipping point came during a heated confrontation between Meredith and Evan in her private study. It began innocuously, Evan asking why she had spent so much time away from the estate lately. But his tone quickly shifted, his questions turning accusatory. "You're pulling away from me," he said, his voice trembling. "You think I don't notice, but I do." "Who else is there, Meredith?" Meredith's patience snapped. "Who else?" she scoffed, her voice cold. "Evan, don't flatter yourself. You're not my husband, and this isn't your house. You're here because I allow you to be here." Her words cut deep, and the look in Evan's eyes shifted from hurt to something darker. But before the tension could escalate further, the door creaked open. Matthew stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I think we all need to have a conversation," he said evenly, his eyes fixed on Evan. Meredith, caught off guard, froze. Evan, however, bristled with defiance. "What's this about?" he demanded. Matthew stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. His presence was imposing, his voice calm but firm. "It's about who you are, Evan. And what you've done." The room felt suffocating as Matthew laid out the pieces of his investigation. He spoke of Samantha, her disappearance, the discovery of her body, and the whispers that had followed Evan ever since. Each word was a knife, cutting away the facade Evan had so carefully constructed. Meredith, her face pale, turned to Evan. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice shaking. Evan hesitated, the mask of charm he wore slipping. "I didn't hurt her," he said, his voice raw. "I loved her." "But she's dead," Matthew interjected, his voice rising. "And you were the last person to see her alive. Don't tell me that's a coincidence." The confrontation spiraled. Evan, cornered and desperate, began to unravel. His defenses turned into accusations, lashing out at Matthew for his failures as a father and at Meredith for using him as a plaything. "You think you're so untouchable," he spat at her. "But you're no better than me. You're just as broken, just as desperate." For the first time, Meredith saw Evan for what he truly was, a man on the edge, consumed by his demons. Fear tightened in her chest, but she refused to let it show. "Get out," she said, her voice steadied despite the storm raging inside her. "You're done here." Evan's eyes burned with anger and betrayal. "You don't get to throw me away," he hissed. "Not after everything." The tension was unbearable, the air charged with unspoken threats. Matthew moved closer to Meredith, a silent gesture of protection. But Evan, sensing the shift, laughed bitterly. "This isn't over," he said, before storming out of the study. As the door slammed behind him, Meredith turned to Matthew, her composure cracking. "Is it true?" she whispered. "About Samantha?" Matthew's face softened, the hardened exterior giving way to a glimpse of the man beneath. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I intend to find out." In the days that followed, the Calloway estate became a battleground of silence and suspicion. Meredith avoided Evan, her fear growing with each passing moment. Matthew, ever vigilant, kept a watchful eye on the young man, knowing the situation was far from resolved. And Evan, driven by a toxic mix of anger and obsession, began to plan his next move. The storm that had been brewing in the Calloway family was no longer contained. The tension had boiled over, and the cracks in their lives were about to give way. As Seattle's unrelenting rain beat down on the estate, the shadows deepened, preparing to swallow them all. The tragedy that had been set in motion years ago with Samantha's death was now hurtling toward a new and inevitable collision, one that would leave no one unscathed. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, the relentless downpour turning the night into a blur of water and shadows. Inside the Calloway estate, the silence was deafening. The grand mansion, usually a place of controlled luxury, now felt suffocating, weighed down by the heavy tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The family's secrets, long hidden in the shadows, were finally coming to light, and the consequences would be far more devastating than anyone had imagined. Meredith sat alone in the parlor, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. She was lost in thought, her mind racing with the events of the past few days. She had pushed Evan away, but his presence still loomed large in her life. He had been more than just a lover, he had become a source of chaos, a reminder of everything she had tried to control but couldn't. Yet as much as she wanted to distance herself from him, she knew deep down that she could not simply erase him from her life. Not without facing the wreckage he had left behind. She thought about Matthew, her husband. His cool, calculating demeanor had never wavered, but tonight something had shifted. The way he had confronted Evan, accusations, revelations, and the sting of old wounds. It was clear to Meredith that the danger had escalated beyond what either of them had anticipated. Matthew, in his own way, had always been a protector. But now, she wondered if even he could stop the coming storm. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling against the windows as the trees outside swayed violently. Meredith's mind returned to Evan, his fury, his desperation. She could feel his anger still, burning in her chest like a smoldering ember. The things he had said, the threats, they kept echoing in her head. "This isn't over." Those words, whispered in rage, had taken root deep within her. Suddenly, the sharp sound of the front door slamming open broke her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood up, instinctively moving toward the source of the noise. She could hear the heavy footfalls of someone entering the house, the door to the study creaking open. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. It was Evan. He had come back. She could hear the sound of his voice, low and urgent, as he moved through the hall, but the words were muffled. Her fear mounted with each step he took toward her, her pulse quickening. She had hoped the confrontation would be the end of it, that Evan would leave for good, but now he was back, angrier, more desperate than ever. He wasn't done with her yet. Meredith took a step toward the door, her mind racing with thoughts of how to handle the situation. She had to protect herself, but how could she? She had no weapon, no way to stop him if things escalated again. Before she could make up her mind, Evan appeared in the doorway of the parlor, drenched from the rain, his hair matted against his forehead. His eyes were wild, his body shaking with adrenaline. His expression was a mixture of rage and something else, something darker, more dangerous. "Meredith," he said, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "You don't get to turn your back on me. Not after everything." Meredith stood frozen, her heart racing as she tried to read his intentions. He wasn't the same man she had once found alluring, the charming, vulnerable figure who had first entered her life. No, this man was consumed with jealousy, possessiveness, and anger. The sweetness had faded, replaced by something far more menacing. "Evan, please," Meredith whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't what you think it is. I can't." "You can't," he cut her off, his voice rising. "No one understands me. No one ever has. You used me, just like everyone else. But I won't let you discard me like this." Meredith took a step back, her mind racing. "I need to get away from him. I need to protect myself." But she couldn't move fast enough. Before she could react, Evan's hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip, pulling her toward him. His eyes were wild, the desperation in his gaze unmistakable. "Evan, let go," Meredith tried to demand, but her voice trembled, the fear in her chest rising like a wave. Evan's breath was ragged as he pulled her closer. "You think you can control everything, don't you? You think you can just walk away from me, like I'm nothing? Well, you're wrong." In that moment, Meredith realized how far gone he truly was. The man she had once manipulated, the man she had thought she could control, was no longer in her grasp. He was out of control, and she was helpless in his grip. Suddenly, the door to the study creaked open again. Matthew stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the scene in front of him. The sight of Evan with his hands on Meredith sent a surge of fury through Matthew's veins, but he remained calm. The years of training, of emotional control, kicked in. "Let her go, Evan," Matthew said, his voice low and steady, a warning wrapped in a command. Evan turned toward Matthew, his expression twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief. You think you can stop me?" he snarled. "You've failed her, Matthew. You've failed her just like you failed your own daughter." The mention of Samantha, his own flesh and blood, sent Matthew into a fury that he could no longer contain. Before either of them could react, Matthew lunged forward, grabbing Evan by the throat and shoving him backward. The two men struggled, but in the chaos of the moment, Meredith's mind went blank. Suddenly, there was a sharp, deafening sound, louder than the storm outside, the unmistakable crack of a shotgun being fired. The force of the blast sent Meredith stumbling back, her heart thundering in her chest. She looked down at her hands, at the blood that was slowly spreading across the floor. Her vision blurred as the darkness closed in around her. The echo of the shotgun blast reverberated through the estate, cutting through the storm's fury like a knife. Meredith's body slumped to the floor, her breath shallow, her vision dimming. The pain was intense, but she couldn't scream, couldn't even move. Blood pooled around her, staining the rich carpet in crimson as the world around her spun out of control. Matthew Calloway, his face twisted with a mixture of shock and anger, stood frozen for a moment, the shotgun still in his hand. His mind raced, but his training kicked in. He had always been in control, even in the most harrowing situations. But this was different. The woman he had married, the woman whose life had become so entwined with his own, was lying on the floor, bleeding, because of a mistake, a moment of blind fury. Evan, still reeling from the violence he had provoked, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "What have you done?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "You," he pointed a shaking finger at Matthew, but he couldn't form any more words. He was paralyzed by the gravity of what had just happened. The woman he had been obsessed with, the woman he had wanted to control, was now a victim of the very chaos he had created. Matthew's voice was cold, almost detached, as he spoke. "I didn't want this, but I couldn't let you destroy everything." His eyes flicked to Meredith's lifeless form on the ground, and for a moment, there was a flicker of regret. But only a flicker. Matthew was not one to succumb to weakness. He knelt down beside Meredith, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. It was too late. The blood loss was too great. Meredith Calloway, the powerful businesswoman, the woman who had built an empire, was gone. And in that moment, the fragile veneer of the Calloway family, of their perfect life, crumbled to dust. Evan, still in shock, backed toward the door. "I didn't," his voice trailed off as he tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before him. His thoughts were muddled, his emotions in chaos. But there was one thing he knew, he was no longer a pawn in Meredith's game. This was no longer about her, it was about survival. He had to escape. Matthew stood up, his face hardening as he turned his attention to Evan. The situation was far from over, and his instincts told him that Evan was not about to walk away without consequences. Matthew wasn't about to let him ruin what was left of his life, of his family's name. "You're not going anywhere," Matthew said, his voice low and commanding. "You've already taken enough from this family." In a flash, Matthew grabbed Evan by the collar and pulled him close. The violence of the moment had escalated beyond anything Evan could have anticipated. He had thought he was in control. He had thought he was the one holding the cards. But in this game, Matthew was always the one who played the deepest. "You're going to make sure no one finds out about this," Matthew said, his grip tightening. Evan's breath hitched. His body shook, not from fear, but from the crushing realization of the truth. He had been used, manipulated, and now Matthew, the man whose life he had upended, was using him in return. He had no choice. Evan knew that if he tried to run, Matthew would find a way to make sure he paid for his part in this tragedy. There was no escaping now. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he released Evan, pushing him toward the door. "Get out of my house. And don't come back." Evan stumbled, still in disbelief, his mind racing with what to do next. But as he turned to flee, Matthew's voice stopped him. "One last thing," Matthew called out. Evan froze, sensing the danger in his tone. Matthew stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Evan's. "I know everything about you," he said, his voice chilling. "I know about your past, your secrets, and how you tried to destroy the Calloway family. But now, you're going to leave, and you're going to forget this ever happened." Evan swallowed hard, nodding quickly. He knew Matthew's words were a promise, not a warning. If he didn't comply, there would be nowhere for him to run. His past, his mistakes, they would all come crashing down on him in a way that could never be undone. Without another word, Evan disappeared into the night, his footsteps muffled by the rain as he fled into the shadows. Matthew stood alone in the empty hallway, the weight of his actions sinking in. His mind raced. He had protected the family, he had protected his name. But at what cost? Meredith was gone. Their marriage, their life together, was irrevocably destroyed. He had killed her, in a way. In trying to protect her from Evan, he had made the ultimate sacrifice. And now, as the storm outside raged on, Matthew was left to pick up the pieces. But there was one final twist, one final revelation that no one, not even Matthew, could have foreseen. As he began to prepare to dispose of the evidence, his phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen, and Matthew's heart skipped a beat. It was from an unknown number. "I know what you did. And I'm not done with you yet." The message, simple and haunting, was a chilling reminder that the past had a way of catching up with those who thought they could outrun it. As the storm howled in the distance, Matthew knew that the darkness of this night was far from over. There were still ghosts to be faced, and he was not yet free. The world outside the Callaway estate continued to be consumed by the storm. The rain lashed against the windows, a steady reminder of the chaos that had unfolded within the walls of the mansion. Inside, the house that once echoed with laughter and the hustle of a successful family now felt like a mausoleum, haunted by the ghosts of its past. The secrets, lies, and shattered trust had turned it into a prison for the man who had built it, Matthew Callaway. Meredith was gone. Her lifeless body, a victim of a broken marriage and a doomed affair, lay as a stark symbol of the destruction that unchecked ambition and obsession could bring. Matthew had tried to control everything, his career, his reputation, and even his wife's desires. But in the end, it was his inability to control his emotions that led to the ultimate tragedy. With Meredith dead, and Evan Ritchie vanished into the night, Matthew was left to deal with the aftermath of his actions. He had always believed that his power, his connections, his mind, would be enough to keep everything in place. But now, standing alone in the empty house, he realized that control was a fleeting illusion. He had lost it all, his wife, his family, and his peace of mind. The house felt empty. Every room now seemed like a distant memory of a life that once appeared perfect. And in the silence that followed the chaos, Matthew's mind began to wander to the consequences of his decisions. The death of Meredith was not just the end of his marriage, it was the end of the Callaway legacy. He glanced at his phone, still lying on the table, the unsettling message from the unknown number still fresh in his mind. "I know what you did. And I'm not done with you yet." The text, simple and cryptic, haunted him more than anything else. It was a warning, one that Matthew couldn't ignore. There was still someone out there, someone who knew the depths of his guilt, someone who had been watching all along. The idea that someone could have access to the darkest parts of his life terrified him. And what terrified him even more was that it was only a matter of time before they made their move. The walls of his life were closing in. Days passed, but Matthew's life didn't return to normal. There was no closure, no peace. The media had descended on the Callaway estate, swirling around the tragedy like vultures. The whispers about Meredith's death, the rumors of Evan's involvement, and the lingering questions about her complicated relationship with Matthew only fueled the fire. The case was still open, and investigators were piecing together the timeline of Meredith's final days. But for Matthew, no one could truly understand the extent of his guilt, the things he had done to protect his family, the lines he had crossed, and the monster he had become. As he sat alone in his study, staring out at the storm, the weight of it all crashed down on him. The money, the power, the success, it had all been for nothing. His entire life, his carefully crafted image, had crumbled in a matter of days. He had betrayed his wife. He had betrayed his family. And now, in the shadows of his broken empire, he was left to face the wreckage alone. And then, just when he thought he couldn't sink any lower, his phone buzzed again. Another message. The same number. "This isn't over, Matthew. I know who you are, and I'll be watching." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The darkness wasn't just about his past actions, it was about the future. The consequences of his choices were just beginning. The shadows were far from finished with him. As the storm outside raged on, Matthew felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders. The past, with all its lies and betrayals, had caught up with him. And no matter how hard he tried to escape it, the shadows would always be there, lurking, waiting to claim him. But there was still one question left, one that Matthew had no answer to. Could he ever escape the consequences of his past? Or was the darkness destined to consume him, just as it had consumed everyone else in his life? What do you think of this story? Was Meredith's death truly inevitable? Could Matthew have escaped the consequences of his actions, or was he always destined to face the fallout? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories like this. What would you have done if you were in Matthew's shoes? We'd love to hear from you.